It was late October when I found myself staying at Marlowe Manor, a sprawling, old estate that had been in my family for generations. My parents were busy on business trips, and I had taken the opportunity to get away from the city for a few days of solitude. The manor was located deep in the woods of Vermont, miles from the nearest town, which made it the perfect place to escape the noise of the modern world. I had always loved the manor. Its towering stone walls, the long hallways, and the sense of timelessness that permeated every room. It felt like stepping back in time. But this time, something felt different. There was a chill in the air that made the old house feel even older, more oppressive, as if the walls themselves were holding on to secrets that had been buried for too long. I was lounging in a large, dusty study on the second floor of the manor, reading an old book of ghost stories and sipping hot tea, when I first heard the noise. A low, raspy voice seemed to whisper through the cracks in the walls. "Help me." I paused, thinking I had imagined it. The wind had been fierce all evening, but the voice sounded human. It was so soft, so faint, but unmistakably real. I strained my ears, listening for any other sounds. Nothing. I convinced myself that it must have been the wind playing tricks on my mind, but the voice lingered in my thoughts. I set the book down and listened intently. The voice repeated itself, a little louder this time. "Help me." It seemed to come from the walls themselves, or perhaps from deep within the manor, but I couldn't tell from where exactly. I felt a shiver crawl down my spine. My mind raced. The house was old. Surely there were all sorts of creaks and groans, but there was something unsettling about that voice, something that didn't belong. I tried to dismiss it as my imagination, but the sound of the voice gnawed at me, impossible to ignore. I stood up and made my way down the grand staircase, the old wooden steps creaking underfoot. The manor seemed unusually still, the silence pressing in on me from all sides. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. When I reached the bottom of the staircase, I was about to head toward the kitchen when I noticed something strange. There was a large, old hook hanging from the doorframe leading into the courtyard. It wasn't there before. I had been through this hall dozens of times, and I had never noticed it. The hook was old, rusted, and had an unnatural, eerie gleam to it, as though it had been waiting for someone to notice it for years. My heart began to pound in my chest. Why was it there? Who had put it there? I stepped closer, my hand instinctively reaching out to touch it, but something stopped me. A cold gust of wind blew through the hallway, carrying with it a faint smell of decay. I recoiled, my senses sharpening. Something was wrong. But what? I couldn't explain it. I hesitated for a moment, then steeled myself, deciding to go outside to see if I could find any explanation for the hook's sudden appearance. I opened the door to the courtyard, which had been abandoned for years. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and damp leaves. As I stepped into the darkness, the wind howled through the trees surrounding the manor, making the branches creak and sway like skeletal hands. I looked around, but there was nothing, just the empty courtyard, the ancient stone walls of the manor and the thick trees beyond. Then I heard it again, a voice, low, raspy, and called from the shadows. "Over here!" I froze. The voice sounded urgent, desperate, but there was something off about it, something unnatural. It echoed in the air, reverberating off the cold stone walls of the manor. I couldn't see anyone, but the voice was unmistakable. It was coming from the darkness in the corner of the courtyard. A figure, barely visible in the moonlight, seemed to shift in the shadows. My heart skipped a beat, and against my better judgment, I stepped closer. The voice called out again, its tone more frantic. "Over here." I felt drawn to it, as though something in my very bones told me I needed help. But I was afraid of what lay in the shadows, of what I might find. I stopped just outside the reach of the darkness, my breath catching in my throat. "Who are you?" I called out, my voice trembling despite my efforts to sound calm. The figure stepped closer, and the moonlight revealed what I had feared. The man was tall, dressed in an old, tattered coat, his face hidden in the shadow of his hood. His left hand was gone, replaced by a long, blood-stained hook. The sight of the hook sent a shudder through me. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. "Help me!" the man rasped. His voice was grating, like nails on a chalkboard, but the desperation in it was real. I'm stuck in the woods. I took a step back, instinctively feeling the cold sweat on my palms. Something about this wasn't right. Something about this man felt wrong. I could see now that his clothes were torn, his skin pale and sickly, as though he had been lost for years. His eyes, dark and hollow, gleamed with a terrifying intensity. My body screamed at me to run, but I couldn't tear my gaze away. Suddenly, he stepped forward, and the air around him seemed to shift. It was as if the temperature dropped by several degrees, the very ground beneath my feet growing colder. The wind whispered through the trees, but it sounded like a warning now, like it was trying to tell me to leave, to get away. "Please," the man begged, his voice low and strained. "I just need help. Help me or I'll never be free." His voice grew deeper, more sinister, the words laced with a strange power that seemed to pull at me from inside. Something about his plea was different now. It wasn't the cry of a man in need. It was a voice of something else. Something older, something that had been lying in wait for years. I stumbled backward, my heart racing, but before I could turn to run, I heard a sharp noise, like the snap of a branch breaking underfoot. The door to the manor slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang. Panic surged through me as I tried to push against the door, but it wouldn't budge. My fingers scrabbled against the cold wood, but the door remained sealed shut, as if something on the other side was holding it closed. I turned around, my breathing shallow, and found that the man was no longer standing in the shadows. The courtyard was empty, but the air was thick with the weight of something watching me. Then I felt it, a cold hand on my shoulder. I whipped around, my heart pounding in my chest, only to find a man standing right behind me. His face was inches from mine, and his eyes, wide, lifeless, and full of malice, stared into my soul. "Help me," he whispered, his breath cold against my skin, "or I'll make you a part of my collection." It started off as a perfect idea. My two best friends, Emily and Jenna, had been talking about going away for my birthday for months, and when I found a secluded cabin in the woods, I knew it was exactly what we needed. It was remote, cozy, and had all the charm we'd want for a weekend escape. No distractions, just us, surrounded by the stillness of nature. We arrived in the late evening, the last rays of sunlight fading behind the trees. The air was crisp and fresh, and the smell of pine filled my lungs. It felt peaceful in a way that only the woods could. We wasted no time getting settled in. Emily started organizing the kitchen. Jenna lit candles around the living room, and I got the fire started in the stone fireplace. We spent the first few hours laughing, playing games, and talking about everything and nothing. The cabin was spacious but rustic, with wooden floors that creaked with every step. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, and the occasional owl hooted in the distance. Everything was just as I'd imagined, peaceful and calm, until the clock struck midnight. I remember being the last one awake, the fire now crackling low, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The warmth from the flames was comforting, but something about the silence felt heavy, like the woods outside were holding their breath. I stretched, glancing around the room. Emily and Jenna were asleep upstairs, their quiet breath barely audible through the walls. I was alone in the living room. The air felt colder now, and my eyes drifted toward the window above the deck. I thought I saw something, just a flicker, really. I dismissed it at first, blaming it on my tired eyes or the shadows. But then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of metal scraping against wood. I stood up from the couch, my pulse quickening. My heart hammered in my chest as I tried to figure out what was happening. I took a step toward the window and hesitated, my breath catching in my throat. My legs felt heavy as I moved closer, each step almost against my will. The curtain was thick, blocking most of the view, but I knew something was out there. My mind raced through all the possibilities. Maybe it was an animal, a raccoon, a bear. I took a deep breath, convinced it was nothing, but as I slowly pulled the curtain back, my blood ran cold. A man stood just outside the window, his face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. His body was cloaked in shadow, and the only thing I could clearly make out was a hook where his right hand should have been. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze, unable to move or even scream. He didn't make a sound. He just stood there, facing the window, watching me. I was paralyzed, rooted to the spot by fear. My thoughts scattered, and I couldn't think of what to do. I tried to look away, but my eyes refused to leave his figure. Time seemed to stretch, each second feeling like an eternity. Finally, I forced myself to step back, stumbling away from the window, my hands shaking as I grabbed my phone. I texted Emily and Jenna, but my fingers fumbled and I could feel panic rising in my chest. No reply. They were asleep. I turned off the lights in a desperate attempt to hide, hoping he wouldn't notice that I was still awake. I moved to the farthest corner of the room, trying to keep my breath steady, but the silence was deafening. Then the door to the deck creaked. The sound of metal scraping against it again. The door was slowly opening, and I realized he was trying to get inside. My heart slammed against my ribs as I ran to the door, fumbling with the lock, my hands slick with sweat. I finally slammed the deadbolt into place, but just as I did, the handle rattled violently. The scraping sound grew louder, and then there was a sharp, almost deafening bang as something heavy slammed against the door. My mind raced, but I had no plan, no idea what to do. I thought about calling the police, but I didn't even know if we had cell service out here. I could hear his movements now. He was circling the cabin, his hook dragging along the walls. I could see the shadow of his figure through the window, passing by in jerky movements. My skin prickled, and I backed away, my phone still clutched in my hand. I had to wake Emily and Jenna. I had to get them out of here. I ran up the stairs, my feet stumbling on each step. I banged on their door, barely able to form words as I shook them awake. "Emily! Jenna!" I screamed. "There's someone outside." They groggily opened the door, still half asleep, but when they saw the fear in my eyes, they didn't ask questions. We ran down the hallway together, the house feeling too quiet, too empty. I thought maybe, just maybe, I had imagined it. But when we reached the stairs and looked down into the living room, the door was ajar. The man was gone, but his presence still lingered. We bolted the windows and locked every door, our hands shaking. The scratching sounds from the deck continued, faint at first, then louder, more insistent. I could hear his footsteps moving around the perimeter of the cabin, scraping, dragging. The three of us huddled together in the upstairs bedroom, praying that the locks would hold. But then, in the distance, we heard a cry, a sharp, animalistic sound that chilled us to the core. The man was gone, but his presence wasn't. The footsteps returned, now at the front door. We heard the scraping again, followed by another heavy thud against the wood. We spent the rest of the night in a terrified silence, only the occasional sound of the man's movements breaking the stillness. As the first light of dawn finally crept through the windows, the sound stopped. The scratching, the thudding, the heavy footsteps. Everything fell silent. The next morning, we ventured downstairs, hoping it had all been a nightmare. The front door was ajar, just as we had left it the night before. The marks of the hook were visible along the wooden deck, deep gouges where it scraped against the wood. There was no sign of the man, but the unease in my chest wouldn't fade. I could still feel him out there, waiting, watching, as if he were just biding his time for the next time we dared to stay at the cabin. We left quickly that morning, not looking back as we drove down the long dirt road that led to the nearest town. We never spoke of what happened that night, but we all knew something was out there, something that wasn't human. And even now, when I close my eyes, I can still see the shadow of the man with the hook, standing just outside the window, watching, waiting for the next time.